Hi, my name is Katie McInerney, and I'm the assistant sports editor at the Boston Globe. Today, I'm joined by filmmaker Eammon Ashton-Atkinson, who created Steelers, a documentary about the first gay rugby club in England. So we all just watched the documentary. We're so glad to have you here. Tell me, where are we talking from here?
So I'm in my back garden in DC. I moved here last week from New York. My husband and I, we won a green card in the visa lottery, actually.
Oh, congratulations.
It was always a dream of mine to move to New York. So that's where I actually edited the film. I moved over there and I didn't really have a lot of work. And it was kind of that thing that I was putting off for ages. And then I had lots of spare time on my hands. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to sit down and finish this because it's a really important story that needs to be told. So I sat there in my tiny little apartment in New York, like not even on a desk. I was sitting on this sort of bar with this bar stool, editing. I think you see it in the documentary there.
Yeah.
It had been about a year since I filmed it, and I sort of actually edited a bit of it in England, and then I reformatted my computer and lost the whole cut.
Oh, that must have been painful.
Yeah, it was. So I was like, right, I can't, bear to think about that anymore. So I sat on it, and it was actually when this Australian rugby player, Israel Folau, started tweeting all these homophobic comments. He put this Instagram post up saying that hell awaits homosexuals, and it became this big story in the rugby world and in Australia, where I'm from. And I was like, you know what, for those kids out there looking at him as a role model, I almost have this duty to finish editing this story. And at first I wasn't going to include myself as a narrator. I was just going to let the characters talk. But when I reformatted my computer and lost everything and started again, I was like, actually, I think I need to tell my story and drive the story forward as a narrator. And it must have meant to be. So, yeah.
That was the first thing that I was wondering. When I was watching and I was taking notes, I was thinking, wow, what a interesting and brave decision to include your own story. And I kind of figured, well, you must still play rugby. Clearly, this is something that's in your life. But I have to say, I was not expecting to hear that you were on the team. And so I just loved that. I loved the reveal. I felt so sad that you weren't able to play in the tournament with your concussion.
Yeah.
But I was curious, did you decide to film the tournament because you weren't able to play and you wanted to participate? Or when you joined the team, were you like, I need to tell this story? And when the tournament came along, were you like, this is the way I want to do it? Why did you decide to film?
It was a bit of both, to be honest. Like I'm a TV journo. I think I sort of explained that in the film. And so I do like 1 minute 30 stories on the evening news back in Australia. And it's not a lot of time to tell a story. And I always wanted to do a documentary. And I had in the back of my mind, like, oh, the Steelers would be a really good subject for that. But it was when I got the concussion, I was like, you know what? I don't just want to go there on the sidelines and drink and get drunk and waste a week and, do that. So I thought this is the perfect opportunity because it's a nice contained couple of days. And and at the time the team was sort of the best team we'd ever had. So there was a really good chance they could win it. And actually when they didn't at the end, I was filming and I was like, oh, that ruins the whole thing. Like there was that perfect story arc that we had. And I was really down about it because I was like, well, the documentary now it's not really worth doing anymore. And it wasn't until I really stopped and thought about it, how can I make this ending work, that actually I think now the fact they didn't win was a more powerful ending for the documentary. And it's funny, like before I was saying so many things had to come together. Like I lost the first edit, actually got married. And the reason I got a concussion was my brother was traveled from Australia to watch the wedding, and he was watching the first game of rugby that any of my family members had ever seen me play.
Oh.
So I was like trying to be all macho and go extra hard, and I went too hard into a tackle and hit my head. And so all these things needed to happen for the film to get made. So yeah.
And you kind of, you say at the end, it's not really about winning the tournament. It's not about coming out as gay. Like, I agree with you. It's sort of like win or lose, the story was there of what this team meant to people, you know, and I loved the choice of the three people who you chose to focus on, Nick and Drew and who's that?
That's Daisy. Oh. She gets very jealous when I talk on the phone to people.
She's crazy.
Yeah. Sorry.
I can't believe she didn't make a cameo. No.
Didn't get this in another audience Q&A.
But I really loved the way that you structured it with the three of Drew and Nick and Simon, and each of them had such an interesting story to tell. And I really thought of Simon when you said that at the end of what he had gone through and what he had experienced, and you know, in juxtaposition of the difficulties that he went through and the way that he was so honest about his depression. And then at the end he was like, you know what, we lost, but my sister just had a baby, my dad's okay. It was like you almost saw right there on film right after that game when everyone was so upset and he was just like, you know what, I am going to be okay. And it was, I just thought it was just a perfect example of like, this is never, winning would have been great, but it was never just about winning, you know?
100%. And I mean, Simon's story, because it was quite similar to my own, like every time I watch it, it just gets me, because he's such a beautiful person, and he's this kind of person that you look at from the outside, and if you went down to training, you think, oh, you're handsome, you're really good at rugby, you've got it sorted. But actually, when you kind of chip away, there's a lot going under the surface there, and I think that's true with a lot of people. And he took a lot of convincing, because we had spoken in the club about being on antidepressants before. And I knew when I set out to make it, when at first I wasn't going to be in the film, I knew I needed to have that storyline. And it was really important for me that he speak. But he was concentrated on the game. His dad was in hospital. His sister just had the baby. So his mind was everywhere. And it really took a lot of gentle pushing at the start. And then a day into the tournament, he's like, okay, I'll do it because I see what you're trying to do. And I'm so glad he did. And he spoke so honestly. And I think one of the things that struck me as a first-time filmmaker was the fact that it was just me and him in that room and with my camera. And I think if I had been there with like producers and the sound guy and another cameraman, like you just wouldn't have gotten that same level of intimacy. So I think moving forward, when I'm sort of thinking about my next project, I think I'd really like to kind of keep that process for me. And it means, yeah, would have been nice to have had another angle with, you know, beautiful depth of field and a camera.
Yeah, sure.
You know, it's a trade-off, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing that going back to your personal experiences and what you shared, I kept on thinking about, there was that one funny moment when your teammates were sort of trying to stage the thing when he had the bandages. And I was just like, it was just a perfect example of, you know, this is a film, you want to tell this story, but it was just so interesting to watch, and just like, these are also your friends, your teammates. And you know, I'm curious to know, and I don't want to jump ahead, I have so many other questions, but what was the feedback? What did the teammates think of it? All the people that were featured and also everyone else who watched, what did they think?
So I finished editing it in New York, and I really wanted to be there when they all saw it for the first time. So I actually booked a ticket back to London to watch it with them, and we booked like this special little screening room. And I said to Nick, Simon and Drew, okay, come first, we'll watch it, the three of us together, and then we'll bring the team along after. And so we sat there and we watched it, and it was like one of the most electrifying experiences I've ever had. There were tears, people were laughing, and it was the first time that I'd watched it with an audience. John, my husband, had seen every iteration of the cut, but the first time watching it with an audience. And yeah, it was this amazing experience. And you know, that bit after the first game when Nick kind of blows up at the team and gets really angry at them.
Yeah.
She was cringing. She's like, no. Well, I know, I love this.
She seemed like a badass in that scene. I was just like, oh, I wouldn't mess with her.
It was interesting, like Simon's dad had actually passed away 2 or 3 days before we showed
Oh
him, and
my goodness.
he still wanted to be there. So the end credits, when it talks about the fact that, and he asked me before, can we dedicate it to his dad? So I managed to actually fit that in the edit that we could show the guys, and so everyone was like bawling then. And then Drew, interestingly, his first reaction was, he was like, oh, look, I'm a little bit embarrassed because my story isn't as deep or as meaningful as Nick and Simon's. And I was like, yeah, but I don't want to say you're the comic relief, but you provide this kind of joy to the film that we can't just have heavy. So.
Absolutely. And that was what I wrote down too, was that, you know, the funnest part was the drag show. Not that it wasn't all fun, but it was just like the joy and his performance and the way that he owned the stage and brought people along. It was just, you know, I thought it was so interesting when he said that some former members thought it was a bad idea, that they pushed back against it. And it felt like the worst kind of irony of, you know, people who identify as gay claiming that there's this stereotype that they have to fight against, and it must be just such a difficult battle to, you know, where people just want to put you into a box and tell you how you're supposed to act. And, you know, I'm curious about what Drew does for the team, because it seems like he's such a personality. He's a person who's a performer. Like he said, he loves to perform. He loves to be the center of attention. You know, I'm really curious to think about, you know, what he sort of brings to your team when he's on the pitch as well.
Oh gosh, he's fierce on the pitch. Like, you would not want to be between the ball and him. He'll take you out. But I think he's like a really deep thinker, and he thinks very much about these issues of identity and gender. And it's interesting because when you have this group of, you know, gay men or people under the LGBT umbrella, like for me, I don't really think a lot about gender issues that, say, a trans person would, or like a drag queen would. And it's kind of refreshing, and that you have to sometimes check yourself, because even though I identify as like part of a minority, like there's a lot of gay people that do a lot of discriminating. They might be sexist, you know, or misogynist, or transphobic. And so when I joined the club and they introduced us to Nick, the head coach, I was like, my first thought, I'm ashamed to say, is like, who is this woman and why should I be listening to her? Like, why should she be telling me how to play rugby? And it was only when she started coaching, and I was like, oh, actually, she's telling me stuff I've never heard before, and it's really good.
You know, that was my first thought too. Well, I should say, when she came on the screen, I was like, you know, and obviously working in sports as a woman, I'm always hyper aware when I see other women in sports. So I was just like, wow, what a curious decision. And something I wasn't expecting. And, you know, I kept on thinking the whole time, like, there's just this through line of confidence. And she talks about it when she took over the team. And she said that, you know, everyone had a belief in themselves at work or with their friends or at the club. But when it came to the sport, that was lost somewhere, and that they were terrible. And she had to build that back up before they can succeed. And I was wondering how much of that therapist versus coach role that she played for you guys. And speaking specifically to that weekend, when it seems like you guys are playing nonstop, like it's a whole week of just really, really intense play. And you know, I'm so curious, when the camera's not on her, is she the same way? Is that how she operates?
She's the same way. She's intense. She lives and breathes it and loves it and cares so much for the team. And I think like it really moved me when I did her interview, because I didn't really know the length of kind of suffering she felt. And she told me the story that I couldn't work out a way to neatly fit it in the documentary. But she told me a story about how they had won a very big game, like maybe a year or so ago, and all the boys went out to party and no one invited her. They forgot to. And she sat in her room in the hotel and cried, because she's like, they just forgot about me. And it's so easy, as a woman in sport, to be forgotten about or overlooked. And I was like, wow, like that's so true. And I sort of, when I was editing the film, I I sent it to a producer friend in Australia, and she said, oh, look, you need to establish Nick's credentials at the start of the film. You need to take this bit from the end and put it at the start, because we need to know that she's not some kind of politically correct appointment. And this is a really respected producer, so I really considered making that change. And then I was actually like, you know what? I like the fact that as an audience member, you sort of do question her at the beginning, but by the end of the film, hopefully you're like, wow, she deserves to be there, and you kind of check your prejudices. But yeah, it's funny because sport is such a wonderful thing for so many lives, and people who, well, I can speak from my own experience. At school, I was always the last person picked. I was always bullied in the change rooms because that's where the teachers weren't there. And I remember I was played, I rowed in the first rowing team at school, and we won the Head of the River one time. And we went to this party, and then it was the first party I'd ever been invited to at school. And I was so excited to be going, and it was with the cool kids. And then I got there, and people that were not on the team were like, oh, why are you here, faggot? Fuck off, poofter. And I was expecting my teammates to kind of stand up for me, going, you know, he was part of the winning team. I was like the number 4, I was the powerhouse. And no one did. And I just left the party bursting into tears, ran home, went home. And my mum's like, why did you leave? And of course I couldn't tell her. So I was like, oh, they were drinking alcohol and I didn't want to do that, you know.
Yeah, your mom.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if my kid said that to me, I'd be like, I will buy the beer. No, I shouldn't actually say that, but.
Well, that's the thing. And that, you know, we talk about the power of sports, and everyone always likes to say, it doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter where you came from, none of that matters as long as you can play and you have a passion. But that's not true, and that's never been true. And we see that, you know, a lot in the US, obviously, in the fact that there's a reason why there are never any openly gay players in our professional leagues, because the discrimination is just something that, you know, it's there and it's real. And it, you know, I was considering that in the context of a sport like rugby, which, God, you have to be so mentally and physically tough to be able to play a sport like that. And, you know, I think you and I would agree, for those people who like to say like, oh, you know, you're not tough enough to play this sport, or, oh, you can't do this if you're gay, or we don't want to play against you if you're gay. I mean, it's BS, for lack of a better word. It's something that, you know, we know not to be true, but it was really interesting to watch that juxtaposition and to hear from the origin story of the club itself that it faced that, and then to see how it's grown. You know, it sort of gave me hope a little bit that, like, yeah, things are changing when they're changing slowly, but look at how this has grown. And I'm curious what you think about that juxtaposition in terms of the sport itself, and you know, being told when we're growing up that you can do anything and you can play whatever sport and you won't be judged, and seeing that yourself that that's not true at all.
It's so true. And like with sport is something that needs time, space, and practice, right? And so if I remember at school, you know, they would throw a ball to me and I couldn't catch it. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, look, he can't catch it. And doing the flappy wrist thing. Like, I probably couldn't catch it, not because I was gay, but because, you know, I haven't had the practice or the space, you know. And I think looking at the club, what was beautiful to see was they have this development team where you can come in with zero rugby experience, and they'll teach you right from the ball handling skills up. And just seeing these kids who have never been invited or allowed to play a team sport before because of their sexuality, like suddenly flourish and realize actually then they're not half bad, and they really enjoy it. Like it was a beautiful thing to watch. And yeah, I think things are changing. And you know, this has been shown in New England and in Boston, and there's a Boston Ironside team, which has 2 teams, like a first team and a development team as well. And I'm friends with some of the guys on the squad. And it's amazing that this sport, which isn't traditionally American, is sort of having is spreading like wildfire. I think there's 30 gay teams in the US. So I wasn't actually quite sure how the film would resonate with an American audience. So it's really nice to hear that you are still picking up on all the things that I wanted it to.
Well, in watching some of those scenes, like the actual scenes of play, it's just like I found it to be a much better illustration than a lot of other, my experience with rugby is a little more pop culture based, like what I know about it is more from films and TV, and to see it played like that on a level that, it's not the highest tier, in a level that is more accessible to a lot of, average athletes.
Yeah,
It was really fascinating to see, and it just reaffirmed in my mind, which is like, wow, I would never be able to do that. And then the people who play this sport have to have a lot of like mental toughness, because I mean, it just felt like it seemed like a grind.
the one thing I love about rugby is that it's like all shapes and sizes. So you can have like,
Yeah.
50 kilograms or 150 kilograms. I still haven't worked out my pound conversion yet. Whatever that is.
So how did you find Steelers? Were you seeking this out when you moved to London, or what led you to the team?
Two ways in a way. The people that I moved in with, who were just random flat shares off a website, that one of them was a player. And separate to that, my best friend, one of her high school friends, who was living in London, so I didn't know anyone there, she put me in touch with him, and he was part of the club. And the weekend I moved to London for the first time was the weekend of that Heaven show. And I remember I couldn't get tickets because it was all sold out. And I remember thinking, I wonder if, I'll join this club, and I wonder if it will, I'll enjoy it. And not knowing, that I would be making a film about it, and I would put my husband through it, and it would change my life. So I think life is just serendipitous and funny that way. But, if people are watching, I guess, like, I spent a lot of my adult life and just unhappy where I was. And I would say if you're thinking about making a change, it doesn't have to be moving a city, but like, just go with your gut, because that's what I did. And I'm so glad. So, yeah.
Lovely sentiment. And as in closing, I guess for you, what's next? Is there another project on the horizon?
So I'm reporting for this Australian TV channel on the election. So it's going to be crazy over the next 2 months, and then I'm looking for my next project. So I've got a few little ideas, but yeah, it's I'm not sure. I'm still just sort of trying to work out what to do, and it's so hard in the pandemic at the moment, because it's not as if it's easy to go out and find people doing things. Everyone's at home, so maybe I need to make a film about people.
A little less interesting than a rugby tournament, but very relevant to our experiences.
But, I just want to thank you so much to the Boston Globe and the festival for having me, because as a journalist, like, everyone just, I sort of look in awe at the Boston Globe, and it's such a well-renowned paper, and to have my story sort of among your selection of films is, an absolute honor. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for joining this and for this conversation, and echoing those sentiments. It's really, really fun to be able to share these types of stories. And I think especially in Boston, it is so, parochial and set in its ways. And sometimes we have our traditions in sports, and we look to these teams that we cherish. And so I always find it to be just a breath of fresh air to learn something new, and to find something new, and give us new ideas and new perspective. And so this was a really wonderful documentary, and I enjoyed every minute of it. And I would watch a sequel if the 2020 tournament ever happens, but it probably won't in the pandemic. So well, are you still playing rugby in the US, even like pre-pandemic? Were you?
So there are 2 teams in DC, actually, and I have emailed them saying, hey, are you doing any training sessions? So my husband, who has a terrible shoulder, has given up, but yes, I'm probably about 15 kilos heavier than when I used to play, so I definitely need some kind of exercise to burn off those COVID kilos.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll see you on the pitch then. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This has been the Globe Docs Film Festival. My name is Katie McInerney, and I was joined by director Eammon Ashton-Atkinson on the documentary Steelers. Thanks so much. And to see our work, go and visit bostonglobe.com.